Hello everyone, welcome to FAD Learning. In our Angular 19 series, so far we have covered all the essential topics, and in the previous video we explored CRUD operations using a JSON server, where we utilized the get, put, post and delete APIs to create, update, read and delete data. We also used the HTTP client module to connect with database. However, Angular 19 introduced a new way to handle HTTP requests using the resource API. So in this video, we will dive into the new features of Angular 19, specifically the resource and rxResource API using a simple example. And what's the difference between the resource and rxResource API? Essentially, we use the resource API for asynchronous operations that return promises, whereas we use rxResource API for asynchronous operations that return observables. Now let's explore how to utilize both resource APIs in our project to perform asynchronous operations. So let me open Visual Studio Code Editor. And until now, we used the JSON placeholder API and also created our own API using JSON server. But for this example, we will use another sample API from the Biceptor website. So let me open browser and I'll open the Biceptor website. And let's select a sample API. So today I'll choose the fake store API. And to use this API, we will store this endpoint URL in a string variable. So to demonstrate this example, I'll create a new component and service using the CLI command. So I'll run command ng generate component name resource API and hit enter. This command will generate a resource API component. Then I'll add a new route for this component inside routes.ts file. So here, let me add one more route for the resource API. And for this path, I'll add component resource API. Now save the changes and let me run this project in another terminal with command npm start. And now if I navigate to localhost 4200/resource API and hit enter, we should see the resource API component rendered in the browser. Next, for the service, I have created a new folder called services, and inside this folder, I have moved all existing services. Now I'll create a new service for the resource API under this services folder using command ng generate service, and I want to create service under this services folder. So first I'll write services and then slash followed by service name resource. Enter. Now inside resource.service.ts file, I'll store the dummy API endpoint. So here let me create new variable with name base URL of type string equals to inside double quotes. I'll copy paste this endpoint URL. But using only the base URL, we can't retrieve any data as you can see here. So to get data, we need to append a specific API endpoint to the base URL. For example, appending this API/products to this endpoint URL, we will retrieve a list of products available in the e-commerce store. Similarly, if I append API/users to this same base URL, we will retrieve a list of all registered users. Here you can see. So let's create a new table and display the same data in the browser. Let me copy this URL and paste it below this URL, and I'll comment out this URL for now. Now, to fetch data from the REST API, we typically send an HTTP GET request to the database, and the database responds with data in the form of an observable, right? So let's do this quickly. So inside this service file, I'll create a method called getAllData, and within this method, we will send an HTTP GET request to the database API to retrieve the data. And to do this, we first need to inject the HTTP client module through the constructor. So private HTTP colon HTTP client. And now we can send the HTTP GET request using the API URL. Return this.http.get, and then inside this get method, I'll use string literals to call the API. Dollar inside curly braces, I'll call base URL, and then I'll append this API slash users. Now I don't need this API, so I'll delete this. Inside this get API method, first I have called the base URL, and after that I appended slash API slash users, because this endpoint returns the user data. Now let's subscribe to this method from the resource API component, and we will store the response in a local variable within that component. So let me open resource API component.ts file, and here first we will inject the resource service through constructor. Private resource of type resource service. After that, I'll declare one variable called API data of type any, and then I'll store the API response to this API data variable. So let's create one method here called getData, and inside this method, I'll call the service method, and I can access service using resource.getAllData.subscribe, and inside this subscribe, I'll store the response in the local variable API data. So this dot API data equals to response. And after that, to load this data as soon as the page loads, we need to call this method inside the ng onInit lifecycle hook. So let me implement onInit, and then we need to define ng onInit method. And inside this, I'll call getData method. And this ensures that the data is fetched and displayed as soon as the component is initialized. Now let's display this API data in the browser through the HTML file. So let me open the HTML file, and inside this file, I'll copy and paste the same table we created for the CRUD operations. So let me copy this table from the CRUD component.html file, and let me paste it inside our resource API component.html file. And now I'll do some minor modifications. I'll update the heading to Angular 19 resource and rxResource API. And I'll change the table color to info, and then according to the API response, I'll update the column names. Let me see the response. User ID, username, email, and password. So here I'll edit this ID with user ID, and next username, next email, and last password. Okay. Now inside tbody, I'll delete these 3 TD. And in order to use this ng4 directive, I need to import the common modules inside the imports array. And then I'll bind this column data with API data. And by matching the property names with the API response, let me synchronize the property names to ensure accurate data binding. So instead of ID, I'll write user ID. Instead of name, I'll write username, then email, and last password. Now save the changes and let me open browser on localhost 4200. Here I am getting an error, property add new user does not exist. Okay, let me delete this button, and now save the changes and let's reload the same page. And as you can see, the API data displayed in the browser. Okay, so this is the process we have followed so far to connect with database. However, starting from Angular version 19, we can utilize the resource and rxResource API to fetch the same data from the backend. So let's understand how to display the data using the resource and rxResource API. So first let's display the data using rxResource API, and then we will move on to using the resource API. But what's important to remember is that both resource and rxResource API serve the same purpose. However, they have unique technical approaches. The main difference between them lies in how they manage asynchronous data. And as I said in the beginning of this topic, resource API works with promises, whereas rxResource API works with observables. So let's begin by exploring the syntax of rxResource API. So inside this service file, instead of this getAllData method, let's create a new variable called rxResourceData equals to, I'll assign the value returned by the rxResource API. And we need to import this rxResource from angular/core/rxjs -interop. Now inside this rxResource API, we need to pass an object with a loader function. And this loader function will be an arrow function that makes an HTTP GET request to the specified URL. So I'll copy this same HTTP GET request from line number 15 and I'll paste it to line number 19. So just like before, this http.get method returns an observable. Now, normally a component needs to subscribe to the service data to retrieve the observable API data. However, rxResource automatically handles subscription and unsubscription to the observable. So as a result, we need to store this rxResource data variable in a local variable within the required component class file. So let me go inside resource API component.ts file, and here inside getData method, let me comment out these three lines, and below that we can simply assign API data to the resource.rxResource data. That's it. Now, if we open the browser, we won't see any data in the table. But if I open the developer tool and if I add the breakpoint in the TS file of resource API component, and now I'll refresh the page, press F10. And now if I over to this API data, there is a method called value. Inside template file, we need to bind the API data with .value method. So by doing this, we can access the data from resource and rxResource API. Now save the changes and let's refresh the browser. Let me remove this breakpoint. You can see the data is now displayed in the table. But remember, this data is coming from rxResource API. Because inside service file, you can see we have used rxResource API to handle the HTTP request. Okay, so I hope this explanation was clear. Now next, let's move on to the resource API. And similar to the rxResource data, I'll create a new variable called resource data equals to, this time I'll use the resource API. So instead of rxResource, I'll write resource. And inside this resource API, again I'll pass an object with a loader function, but this loader function defines an asynchronous operation that returns a promise. So this time I'll use the fetch API instead of this http.get API. And inside this fetch call, I'll pass this same API URL. And then I'll use the .then method to pass the response data as a JSON. So I'll use .json method with response. And finally, I'll return promise of type any. Okay, so let me break down this line of code. This fetch method sends an HTTP request to the specified URL, and this .then method is called after the response is received. And this response.json method parses the response data into JSON format. And last, as promise of type any is a type assertion, it tells us that the passed JSON data is returned as a promise of type any. Okay, so in summary, this loader function does three things. It fetches data from the URL, parses it as a JSON, and returns the result as a promise. Now, next step is inside the component class file, I'll store the resource data in a variable. And same we did for rxResource API. So let me open the TS file, and inside this, I'll copy this line number 26 and comment out for now. And here, instead of rxResource data, I'll use resource data. It means I am assigning the resource data to the same local variable API data. And inside template file, we have already bound the API data with the dot value method, because as I mentioned earlier, when using the resource and rxResource APIs, we need to use dot value method to access the data in the template file. Okay, so now let's test the output in the browser. And once again, we have access to the same data using the resource API. So the conclusion is both resource and rxResource API automatically handle subscription and unsubscription to observables, and we can use resource API for asynchronous operations that return promises, whereas we can use rxResource API for asynchronous operations that return observables. So that's all for now. Thanks for your time, and don't forget to subscribe to FED Learning for quick and easy learning. We will meet again in the next video. Until then, keep learning and keep visiting. Thank you. Bye bye.